Next witness.
What do you do at NMS Labs?
I am a forensic toxicologist at NMS.
And did you have any other lab experience before joining NMS?
Yes, I did. Prior to joining NMS from 1994 to 2011, I was the chief toxicologist for the Wayne County, Michigan Toxicology, New York.
Okay, we get it. He's qualified.
Forensic toxicology board for reaccreditation. That means it thousands of tests a day.
Tens of thousands of tests a year. My math is bad. All right, is NMS a licensed and accredited lab?
It is.
And does that include national accreditations as well?
National and state accreditations. We tested samples that were labeled as hospital blood, and we also
Oh no, this is the DA that I can't stand.
tested urine that was collected at the autopsy.
And in terms of the testing that was performed at NMS Labs, were those tests pursuant to standard operating procedures at the lab?
Yes, they were.
And that process was followed for all of those tests?
Yes.
Followed as much as the procedure where the state person missed the pills in the car when she was supposed to inventory evidence?
Getting to the results from that testing, what were the notable findings from that testing?
So the most notable findings in the hospital blood was the presence of fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter, and then the metabolite of fentanyl, the breakdown product of fentanyl, norfentanyl, at a concentration of 5.6 nanograms per milliliter. In addition, we found methamphetamine at 19 nanograms per milliliter.
So I'm going to talk about each of those substances one by one, and you indicated these were the results from the hospital blood in this case, is that right?
That's correct.
So let's start with methamphetamine. What is methamphetamine?
So methamphetamine is a central nervous system stimulant. It can actually be prescribed. It rarely is, but it can be prescribed under the brand name Disoxin, and it is used for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and also obesity. It was also experimentally used for treatment of narcolepsy. And between 2016 2018, there were about 10,000 prescriptions in the U.S. written for Disoxin that year, each year.
So can methamphetamine be both a street-level recreational drug and also a prescription drug?
It can.
With respect to...
Notice they're implying that he was on medical, but they're not saying it, but they're leaving it out there for somebody to jump to that conclusion.
The results, the 19 nanograms per milliliter that you found of methamphetamine, what significance, if any, is there to that amount?
Well, that is actually approximately the amount that you would find in the blood in somebody that was given a single dose of methamphetamine as a prescribed drug.
So when you say, you described the prescription drug form in which methamphetamine can be available, the results would be consistent with the prescription dose of that, is that right?
Yes, it could be.
Would that be considered a low level of methamphetamine?
Yes, very low.
And you also...
Well, hopefully the defense is making a note. Although it's a low level, when you tested, it could have been very high an hour before. Or what's the attrition rate of methamphetamine in a system of somebody taking fentanyl and then figure out, what it was an hour before? Because they do that with alcohol.
Also talked about the fentanyl results of 11 nanograms per milliliter. First, what is fentanyl?
So fentanyl is a opioid analgesic. It's used similar to morphine. It's much more potent than morphine. It can be used to treat pain and also be an adjunct use in surgery and for anesthesia.
And you talked about opioids. Maybe you could just describe what an opioid is.
So opioids actually include both natural, semi-synthetic, and synthetic drugs that act on a mu receptor, which are where opioids act. Opiates are natural products that are found in a poppy plant, such as morphine and codeine. So opiates are opioids, but not all opioids are opiates.
So what are some examples of opioids?
So fentanyl would be an example of an opioid.
Would oxycodone also be an opioid?
Yes, it would.
And then you talked about similarities between opioids and opiates. Is that right?
Yes.
And you mentioned morphine as an opiate.
Yes.
Is that heroin?
So heroin is actually made from morphine, but when heroin breaks down, it breaks down into a metabolite called 6-acetylmorphine, and then eventually to morphine.
So heroin would break down into 6-acetylmorphine and morphine. Is that right?
Yes.
Do opioids and opiates have similar effects?
Yes.
Getting back to the fentanyl level in this case, you mentioned it was 11 nanograms per milliliter. Can fentanyl levels vary widely depending on an individual?
Yes, they can.
Oh, here's where they're going to try to get in. He has such a high tolerance that 11 isn't really that bad.
And why would that be?
because of tolerance.
And could you just explain how an individual's drug tolerance might affect the impact a particular drug, like an opioid or fentanyl, might have on them?
So, I mean, if a person becomes tolerant to a drug, you need to have more and more of the drug to get the desired effect. So, with chronic use, to get the same feeling that you would at a given concentration of fentanyl, you need to take more to get that effect.
You may need to take more to get the feeling, but the reaction to the body increases the more you take. The body, well, I guess when you develop a tolerance, you don't show the symptoms. I don't know how to phrase that question to get a good answer.
And so if someone is regularly using opiates or opioids, would that individual then develop a tolerance to an opioid like fentanyl?
Yes.
All right. Now, you also talked about norfentanyl. Could you just describe what norfentanyl is?
So when the body gradually eliminates fentanyl, it breaks it down from fentanyl to norfentanyl. That's a gradual process that occurs over time. And it's one of the ways the body eliminates fentanyl.
And you indicated that the amount of norfentanyl found in the hospital blood in this case was 5.6 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Yes.
And what is significant about that amount of norfentanyl?
Well, it shows that some of the fentanyl was metabolized to norfentanyl. It also could mean there was pre-existing norfentanyl with additional fentanyl given on top of that. But it basically shows that when we see very recent deaths with fentanyl, we frequently see fentanyl with no norfentanyl whatsoever, because after a very acute fentanyl intoxication, the body doesn't have time to break it down.
And you described when you see a fentanyl overdose, typically you may not see any norfentanyl or low levels of norfentanyl.
Correct.
However, in a chronic user, while someone is using it consistently, he will always have both in his system, correct?
In addition to those findings from the hospital blood, were there some other findings as well that were included in your report?
There were some incidental findings. I believe there was cocaine, which was from smoking. There was caffeine. There was evidence of prior marijuana use by the presence of cannabinoids.
Nicotine, marijuana, meth, fentanyl, 90% blockage, high blood pressure, fighting with the cops, eating dope on the scene. Nothing to do with his death, according to the good doctor. It was the knee.
I would have to look at the report to know.
And would that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
If we could put on the screen, just for the witness's recollection, Exhibit 624, please. And then if we could zoom in on the positive findings portion. All right. Referring to your report now, could you describe the other findings with respect to this case?
Yeah, so the additional finding was a compound called 4-ANPP. That is actually a precursor to fentanyl manufacturing, but it is also a metabolite of fentanyl. It's not pharmacologically significant. That's probably mostly inactive, but it was measured as part of some additional testing that was requested by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner. And then in the urine findings, we had presumptive positive findings, not confirmed for cannabinoids, amphetamines, and fentanyl. Those were not confirmed because they were present in the blood, so that follows that. And then we also had findings for opiates in the urine, and we were asked to confirm those, and we found a concentration of morphine in the urine of 86 nanograms per milliliter.
Apologies. Sorry, you were saying that you found morphine in the urine.
She never listens to her witness. Watch, as soon as she answers a question, she looks down and she is so freaking irritating. If she was my prosecutor, I'd make her repeat every freaking question to make sure that would irritate me.
86 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Correct.
And was that morphine found in the blood?
No, it was not.
And can a finding of morphine in the urine be indicative of a prior use in advance of the time of death?
Yes, it can. You can see morphine in the urine for several days, depending on the dose and prior use pattern.
And again, is that because it shows up in urine longer than blood?
Yes.
So you tested both hospital blood as well as the urine. You described the findings in the urine with respect to morphine. You were also discussing the 4-ANPP finding in the hospital blood. With respect to the other findings in your report, can you just sort of summarize what they were and whether they were significant at all?
So I think I mentioned, so there was caffeine, which is present in many of us, and cotinine, which is present as a metabolite of nicotine from smoking. And then cannabinoids, there was delta-9 THC at 2.9 nanograms per milliliter, and its breakdown product 11.
He's reading, Your Honor. He's not testifying. He's supposed to look down and then Not read.
hydroxy delta-9 THC at 1.2 nanograms per milliliter, and then the inactive delta-9 carboxy THC at 42 nanograms per milliliter.
And when it comes to these THC findings or THC findings relating to cannabinoids, what, if any, impact does that have?
It's very hard to interpret those, given the nature of the samples, and also what happens with cannabinoids, because they go into the fat, so they can be released slowly with time. And certainly, anything like CPR or something like that is potentially going to release THC from the fat. So it doesn't really mean a whole lot other than cannabinoids are used at some point in time.
So they can remain in the system and be detected for an extended period of time. Yes. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. We can take that down. Thank you.
I think a hair test will tell you how long ago and how often it's used. If you really cared about that answer, you would have done a hair follicle test. But you didn't, because you didn't care. You're just trying to confuse the jury and make them think that marijuana and he wasn't using all these drugs and they were old and they're not important and it was the knee.
Now, as part of your testing process at NMS Labs, were there also some metabolites or other substances that were detected as part of the testing, but below your lab's reporting limits?
There she goes, looking down. I asked the question. Let me figure out what I'm going to do while I'm not listening to him. Let me do something else. Rude, poor questioning skills.
So we did find substances that were below the threshold to report, and that is why they're not on the report. But they are in part of the data package that was requested, and one can see those there.
And do you keep those litigation packages or that data as part of your standard operating procedures or the course of business at NMS Labs?
So all of the data is part of the course of business. The litigation package is actually pulled from that data on request, but yes.
So as part of your testing, the lab's testing of the samples in this case, I'd like to ask about the testing process for methamphetamine and whether there were findings of amphetamine.
Sure. So when we had a positive, the screen was positive for methamphetamine by a method called LC time of flight mass spectrometry. And anything that's positive above a certain threshold by that procedure is then confirmed by an alternate procedure. In this case, methamphetamine was positive on a screen, and we ran the confirmation test for amphetamines. The amphetamines confirmation test actually consists of 10 compounds, but we're only interested in the target compounds that we are actually confirming in this case. So in this case, we did detect methamphetamine, and because it's a metabolite of methamphetamine, there was evidence of amphetamine, but it was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
And you indicated that amphetamine is a metabolite of methamphetamine, is that right?
Correct.
And does that mean then that the body breaks down methamphetamine into amphetamine over time?
Yes, it does.
In addition to confirming the presence of amphetamine, was there also an indication on initial testing of buprenorphine?
There was an indication on the LC time of flight screen, but because it was below the reporting limit, it was not confirmed, so it's merely an indication.
And when you say indication, that just means it didn't go through that second step of the process, is that right? What is buprenorphine?
Buprenorphine is a drug that's prescribed. It's called Suboxone, and it's typically prescribed for opioid agonist therapy for people that are going through opiate treatment.
And are the components of Suboxone both buprenorphine but also naloxone?
And that's what they left. That's what the great state super educated female in charge of searching the vehicle left in the front seat and on the floorboard, is that drug, which was found in his system on a murder investigation. The incompetence. I hope somebody can tell me why he didn't do a cross-examination on her.
Naloxone.
Yes.
And is naloxone essentially generic Narcan?
Yes.
Getting back to the blood that was tested in this case, you indicated that it was hospital blood, is that right?
That's correct.
What's significant about using hospital blood for testing?
Well, hospital blood is if it's antemortem blood, is more representative of what is actually circulating in the body prior to the time of death. After death, there are changes that occur with drug concentrations, particularly in central blood, such as blood collected from the heart. And that's a phenomenon known as post-mortem redistribution, where drugs go from areas of higher concentration to a lesser concentration. That is less of an issue with peripheral blood samples, such as femoral blood, but it can still occur. So it's ideally you would want to try to get a sample as close to the time of death as possible.
And if a blood sample is taken after death or after extensive CPR on a patient, can there be some post-mortem redistribution?
I think that's possible. There's a lot you don't know, but it certainly is possible, and if it does, it tends to increase concentrations.
When you say increased concentrations, does that mean that the level might show higher than it actually was at the time of death?
Correct.
What about hemolysis? What's hemolysis?
Homolysis is the breakdown of a red blood cell.
And does that, or did it have any impact on the testing in this case?
No, I mean, that would have an impact on certain clinical chemistry tests like potassium, which is stored in red blood cells. But when you analyze a blood sample for drugs, you're analyzing the whole sample, so it would have no effect.
So you mentioned that NMS Labs receives thousands of samples a day, tens of thousands of samples a year. Did you review and compile some data from the year 2020 with respect to NMS's fentanyl cases and methamphetamine cases?
I did.
And would those help you to contextualize the results in this case?
Sure.
Your Honor, I would offer for demonstrative purposes.
Any objection for demonstrative purposes?
Sorry, Your Honor?
Exhibit number
920.
received to illustrate the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Dr. Eisenschmidt, I'm going to have you describe what's shown on the screen.
So as of right now, we're looking at what happens when fentanyl is metabolized over time to norfentanyl. So gradually, the amount of fentanyl starts to decrease and the norfentanyl starts to increase.
And that's what happens as the body metabolizes fentanyl, is that
That
right?
is correct.
Next slide, please. And could you describe what's shown here, please?
So this is data from NMS Labs from year 2000, and we looked at the fentanyl concentrations in post-mortem cases, specifically in those, and only those, that were collected in peripheral blood. Again, for the reasons I mentioned before, central blood, like cardiac blood, can have a significant post-mortem.
Did he say in the 2000 or 2020? It says 2020, but I thought he said 2000.
Redistribution. So we wanted to look at samples that have a minimal amount of that.
I think you indicated the year 2000. Is this data from 2020?
Sorry, 2020, my mistake.
Okay.
So this is from the year 2020. And we had 19,185 cases that we looked at. And in the peripheral blood in these postmortem cases, the mean fentanyl concentration, average fentanyl concentration was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter. And the median concentration was 10, median being 50% above and 50% below.
And with respect to peripheral blood, you indicated that you chose the samples that would have minimal postmortem redistribution. Is that right?
Correct.
And why is that in comparison to this case?
Because the sample that we had, hospital blood, is probably going to have less issues with postmortem redistribution than it would have had it been postmortem blood.
And in these cases that are represented as postmortem cases, are these cases that you would be getting from ME's offices or coroner's offices?
Correct.
And where the individual would be deceased or dead?
Correct.
Okay, so
And we also looked at the norfentanyl concentrations, and those were 6.01 as a mean, and the median down at 2.2 nanograms per milliliter.
Post-mortem, I believe, means they're dead, but good question on top of it, DA.
So just to clarify, with respect to these postmortem cases, the average level of fentanyl was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter, and the average level...
Okay, so here's where they're going here. They're saying that he had 11 nanograms, which really isn't anywhere near the mean level where people died. So therefore, the fentanyl didn't kill him, it was the knee. Again, taking everything in isolation and not considering the compound effect of the marijuana, methamphetamine, fentanyl, nicotine, caffeine, a tumor. He's a smoker, high blood pressure, 90% blockage. He's eating drugs, he's fighting, and he's COVID positive. See, they're knocking all these down to individuals.
Of norfentanyl was 6.01 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this slide shows some postmortem cases with no norfentanyl, again for the year 2020. So out of those 19,185 cases, we had 15,455 that included fentanyl and norfentanyl, but there were 3,724 cases with no norfentanyl. There were 6 that were exceptions to that for reasons of testing purposes, but those were ones that were only fentanyl but no norfentanyl.
So does this slide indicate that there was a significant number, this 3,724 cases, where there was fentanyl found but no norfentanyl at all?
Correct.
All right, next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is switching gears. We're looking at the DUI, driving under the influence, fentanyl concentrations that we found in 2020. So these are blood samples that are sent to NMS labs for people that were suspected of driving under the influence of drugs or potential other reasons of way they were driving. And in this case, we tested. We had 2,345 cases. That were individuals that were alive that had fentanyl on board. Of course, other drugs may also be present, but this was specifically looking at fentanyl. And we had a mean concentration of 9.5 nanograms per milliliter, a median of 5.3, and then for norfentanyl, a mean of 5.42 and a median of 2.
So he was over the mean for driving, which is why, nobody's gone over. How many charges was George Floyd facing had he lived? Counterfeit, conspiracy, destruction of evidence, resisting arrest, possession of fentanyl and methamphetamine. I mean, how many charges was this guy looking at had he lived? Oh no, Rick, that doesn't matter. It was the knee. Okay, I got it.
2.
And again, just to clarify, for these 2,345 cases, those individuals were alive, is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated the average fentanyl level, I believe, is 9.59 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
And the average norfentanyl level for those cases was 5.42 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right? Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this is just a breakdown of the fentanyl concentrations we found in drivers that were alive. So almost the majority of them were under 5 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl. And then we had another 26.3% that were between 5.1 and 10 nanograms per milliliter. And then the next set of data was we had 216 cases which were between 11 and 15 nanograms per mil. So that would be in the same area of Mr. Floyd's level of 11 nanograms per milliliter. And then we had quite a few cases that were even greater than that. We had 109 that were between 16 and 20, 81 that were between 21 and 26, 133.
Again, we're saying that Mr. Floyd's level was not that bad and it couldn't have killed him because we've had people driving with that. But ignore the meth, the nicotine, the caffeine, the marijuana, the COVID positive, the fighting with the cops, the eating of drugs, the 90% blockage of his heart, the high blood pressure. He's a smoker and he had a tumor. Let's ignore all those. Those are just the elements we know. I'm sure there's things we don't know.
Between 26 and 50, and then we actually had 53 cases in living subjects where the fentanyl was greater than 50 nanograms per milliliter.
So comparing Mr. Floyd's level to the driving population, where individuals were alive, his level was within a quarter of the pie of the DUI cases that NMS Labs has received. Is that right?
Right. He would be right in there with about the 80th percentile.
So the defense should be asking, although Mr. Floyd level is driving, do you know if any of those drivers was using methamphetamine? No. Do you know if any of them were smoking marijuana? No. Do you know if any of them had high blood pressure? No. Do you know if they were taking opiate medicines, Sucanol? No, I don't know that. Do you know if they had a COVID positive? No. So by saying that the 11 is where Mr. Floyd was at, you're talking in an isolated incident. If there was only fentanyl, that's where Mr. Floyd would be. That's how I would drive home and negate this slide.
And you indicated that those levels for drivers were found in 53 cases higher than 50 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
So those individuals were alive and essentially driving at that time.
Yes, pretty amazing.
All right. Next slide, please.
Whoa. You hear him say it's pretty amazing? I would definitely follow up on that. You said it was pretty amazing. Why did you say that? Because 3 milligrams can kill you, or nanograms can kill you of fentanyl. Just because he's running around with 11 and driving isn't a good thing. 3 can kill you.
And what's shown here?
So this is basically the post-mortem concentrations or samples that hospital blood samples that were submitted by Mr. Floyd, and we found fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter and norfentanyl at 5.6 nanograms per milliliter.
Next slide, please.
So this slide shows what the ratio of the parent drug to the metabolite is. So 11 nanograms per mil divided by 5.6, the norfentanyl gave Mr. Floyd a ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl of 1.96.
And essentially, does this slide show just the way in which you would calculate the fentanyl to norfentanyl ratio?
Yes.
Okay, another question I'm going to ask. when he died, his body stopped processing. So had he just ingested a large amount of fentanyl 5 minutes before, all of that would not be equating into the numbers found after he died, correct? Because he could have still been going up on the scale.
Next slide, please. What's shown on this slide?
So this slide shows the ratios of fentanyl levels between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter. So that range was chosen because Mr. Floyd's fentanyl concentration was 11 nanograms per milliliter. And when we do driving under the influence work, we actually assign an uncertainty of measurement to that result. So if a driver had an 11 nanogram per mil fentanyl present, we would report that as 11 nanograms per mil plus or minus 2 nanograms per milliliter. So I did this to see, well, what kind of ratios do we see between postmortem and DUI cases when the fentanyl level is between 9 and 13 nanograms per mil? What kind of ratio do we see? And we can see in the postmortem cases, the mean ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl was 9.05 with a median of 5.88 versus the DUI population where the mean was 3.2, median 2.24.
And then just to clarify, in the bar that shows the postmortem cases, were there 3,088 cases that you looked at between the range of 9 to 13 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter.
And the ratio in the postmortem cases was 9.05 on average, is that right?
Correct.
And then with respect to the DUI cases, you were looking at 275
She always goes back over the same freaking slide that he just talked about.
cases between the range of 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
That's correct.
And so the average ratio within that group was 3.20.
I would object, ask, and answered. He already asked her to explain his side. She explained his side. Your Honor, she's just repeating what he's already testified to.
Is that correct?
Yes.
How does Mr. Floyd's ratio compare to that data set?
So Mr. Floyd's ratio is roughly just a little bit below the median ratio in DUI. So in postmortem cases, we know fentanyl concentrations can be much higher than norfentanyl concentrations because frequently these are deaths due to fentanyl. Other drugs may be present, and there could be other reasons for the death. It doesn't say that these are all fentanyl intoxications. But just looking at it as a whole, with a large amount of data, this is what we observed. And we know with the DUI population, they are alive, but other drugs may be present as well. So it's really just to sort of look at how things look differently in the living and postmortem population.
And does this slide also show that Mr. Floyd's ratio was below the average and even below the median for that found in DUI cases?
Yes.
Right, next slide, please.
So this slide is actually just a sort of a summary of the previous slide, but it basically shows the relationship between fentanyl and norfentanyl between the postmortem DUI cases and Mr. Floyd's.
And again, does it show how norfentanyl levels essentially increase over time in relation to the fentanyl levels?
As one lives and metabolizes fentanyl, yes.
Next slide, please. Now, did you also look at data with respect to methamphetamine for 2020 at NMS Labs?
We did.
And what's shown on this slide that's up right now?
So this slide shows the concentration of the methamphetamine found in Mr. Floyd's hospital sample. It was 19 nanograms per milliliter. And then, as we talked about earlier, amphetamine was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
Not reported, but detected as part of your confirmation process.
You can see it in the confirmation data, yes.
Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this slide shows DUI methamphetamine cases with amphetamine and without amphetamine as a metabolite. So we had 3,271 cases that had methamphetamine in our driving under the influence population. 2,975 of these included amphetamine, and then 296 were just methamphetamine with no amphetamine.
And again, when we're talking about the DUI population, these are individuals, this 3,271 number, individuals who are alive, is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is a further breakdown of what we see in our DUI methamphetamine cases. So the mean methamphetamine concentration in all of our DUI cases was 378 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine. The median was 240 nanograms per milliliter. And in the 5 to 20 nanogram per mil range, with 5 being our lowest limit of quantitation, we had 192 cases between 5 and 20 nanograms per milliliter, which is in that range that Mr. Floyd's methamphetamine was.
And does this graphic also show Mr. Floyd's level of 19 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, it does. It shows on the bottom. And again, 94% of the DUI cases that we tested had methamphetamine concentrations in excess of 20 nanograms per milliliter.
So in essence, Mr. Floyd's level was within the bottom 5.9%, is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is just a further breakdown of what kind of methamphetamine concentrations we have observed in drivers in the last.
Okay, I'm tired of looking at methamphetamine and drunk drivers. Newsflash. Hey, jury, George Floyd's not being charged with drunk driving. Just in case you got confused.
In 2020.
Maybe they're trying to charge Chauvin with drunk driving.
And again, other drugs may be present. But in this case, we had 196 cases between 5 and 20, 306 between 21 and 500, 1 and
Right?
Correct.
And your nanogram exceptionally low.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Oh, going right in the cross. Good. It would be nice if the cross had a nice slide that showed how much fentanyl is given to somebody for medical purposes in their system, which is safe and which is considered unsafe. Another thing he should be hitting on is the poly drug use. How do drugs interact with each other? And every time you add another drug, you multiply, exponentially, you multiply the different things that can happen. Because meth and marijuana will act different. Meth and fentanyl will act different. Marijuana and fentanyl will act different. Fentanyl and marijuana will act different. Then you start changing which one is more, which one is less, which one is stronger, which one is he processing, which one has a higher tolerance, which one is... So the poly drug use does all kind of things, not to mention when you put all these chemicals in your body produces natural chemicals of stimulants and depressants, which all compound all types of testing, etc., on what's what.
All right. It's a little unusual for you to be testifying in a death case, is not?
Not terribly. I mean, I do work with medical examiner and coroners a lot, but
He didn't ask if you work with coroners. He asked if you testified or if it's unusual for you to testify. He should have asked, how many times have you testified in a death case? See, it's kind of unusual. He allows the witness to dictate the answer instead of saying, how many times have you testified in a death case? That's easy.
they typically are the ones that testify as the cause and manner of death. Usually, if I'm involved in a death case, it's usually drug delivery resulting in death.
Okay, and so you work in a laboratory that works with medical examiners from around the country, right?
Correct.
And you perform these services in a variety of different contexts. Agreed?
Yes.
So you testify that some are clinical in nature, some tests are clinical in nature, some are law enforcement in nature, and some are death related, right?
Correct.
All right. And you, at the time you became involved in this case, you were obviously aware of the significance of this case, right?
Yes.
And your laboratory goes through an accreditation process, correct?
We do.
And part of the accreditation process is to establish standards and reporting thresholds, right?
Yes.
And so the reason a laboratory will have those thresholds is to be consistent in how toxicology is reported to various individuals, right?
Correct.
And so one of those accreditation standards is actually to have and set this threshold that if a particular chemical component is below that threshold, you would suggest not reported, right? Or you would say it's not reported.
So there are instances where a medical examiner might ask us if something was present below a threshold, and depending on what the situation is, it could be potentially reported as such. It's not common practice. In this case, we didn't do that.
It's not common practice to report things that are below, or chemical components below the threshold, because it's contrary to the accreditation standards. Agreed?
So it does depend on the situation, but by and large, there's a reason we have cutoffs, and if we go below those, it basically is not something we typically would do.
Right.
What's the point?
So an analyst who comes in hypothetically and may see certain markers that have an indication that something is present, but refuses to acknowledge its presence, that would be because of those accreditation standards, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Hypothetically speaking, if an analyst from, say, the state crime lab comes in and a question is presented to her about the presence of a particular substance, but that substance was below the reporting thresholds.
I'm going to object, Your Honor. That's what I said, is go characterize
It's a hypothetical.
Overruled.
And that analyst refuses to acknowledge.
She thought she'd get an objection in. He already gave him hypotheticals earlier. You think if she was paying attention, that's probably the same damn DA that was up here questioning that ain't paying attention. She just stuck her head up and yelled objection.
Refuses to acknowledge the possibility of the presence, right? That would theoretically or hypothetically be because of those threshold rules.
So I really can't speak to what is done in a crime lab because I don't work in that area. So for me, it's really limited to toxicology and the analysis of biological samples like blood or urine.
So, in other words, the reason we have these thresholds is so that we set the rules, right?
So the reasons these thresholds were actually established, it has to do with the original validation of method. The thresholds are not set because of any standard that says this is what you have to use as a threshold. The laboratory establishes those and then writes SOPs in accordance with their validation for the procedure.
SOPs being standard operating procedures. Yes. And so if the laboratory sets this standard and says, here's the standard, and then does something in contravention or reports something that is against that standard, that would be a violation of the standard operating practice, right?
If it were reported without any explanation, yes.
Okay. So just a few kind of follow-up questions to your testimony. You've met with, or
I'm assuming that somebody testified that something was there that was below standard or report. I still don't understand where that question went.
Spoken with members of the prosecution team several times, right?
Yes.
Including February 26th, March 5th, March 12th, April 5th, and April 6th?
That sounds right. I don't know the exact dates.
Understood. You wouldn't disagree with me if I told you those were the dates?
I wouldn't.
And I was provided with meeting notes and summaries of your conversations, right?
Yes.
All right. So I just want to make sure that...
Who thinks those summaries are complete on what they talked about? Raise your hand. I ask because you're an idiot.
I understand and the jury understands the difference between fentanyl and norfentanyl, okay?
Okay.
You would agree that fentanyl is the active ingredient, or when you report the fentanyl concentration, it's the active ingredient, right?
Yes.
Now, when a person ingests essentially any substance, controlled substance, doesn't have to be an illegal drug, the body metabolizes that, correct?
Yes.
And then the body eliminates that, right?
Yes.
Through the natural processes of the body,
Yes.
right? And the elimination of the substance results in what's called a metabolite, agreed?
Yes.
And so fentanyl being the active ingredient, norfentanyl is the metabolite or the breakdown, correct?
Yes.
And included in this particular case, you discovered a fentanyl concentration of 11 nanograms per milliliter, right?
Yes.
And a norfentanyl level of 5.6?
Yes.
Now, you testified on...
How much fentanyl does it take to produce 5.6 non-fentanyl?
On direct examination, that could be one of two scenarios occurring there, right?
Yes.
One scenario is that a person took a certain amount of a controlled of fentanyl, and enough time had passed to eliminate that, correct?
Correct.
Or to break it down and have that metabolite being present. That's one scenario, right? The other scenario, as I understand it, is someone took some, that initial dose began to break down, and then the person took more, and so the active ingredient is there, but it had not yet broken down, right?
Correct.
So it's sort of either, and you describe it, I think, as an acute ingestion or a non-acute ingestion.
So, a person, when you have fentanyl will break down to norfentanyl, but you could still take more fentanyl. So you could still take fentanyl while the first fentanyl was breaking down.
Right. So to put it into context of people who may consume alcohol, right? I have a beer. My alcohol concentration is going to rise to a certain level, right? Whatever based on the alcohol concentration. Agreed?
0.02.
And my body will essentially immediately begin to decrease and eliminate the alcohol, right?
Correct.
But if I have a second beer, I'm adding more alcohol, causing my blood alcohol concentration to rise. Correct?
Yes.
And that's similar with all substances, including fentanyl.
In general, yes. I mean, so alcohol is eliminated at a fixed rate over time. There's only so much you can eliminate with time. With drugs, some drugs, it's a little different. But
some drugs may be faster, some may take longer, right? And when you describe the results in this particular case, you're talking about, I'll strike that, sorry. So there's, from base...
For those that don't know, strike that and just means ignore that. I didn't ask that. I don't want to finish it. I don't want to go into an objection area. I'm going to ask it a different way. That's what, when they say strike that, that's what that means.
On a strict interpretation of these test results, there's no way to determine at what point any particular amount of fentanyl was ingested. Agreed?
I would agree with that.
Now, fentanyl, again, being a toxicologist, is a lawfully manufactured controlled substance in the United States, right?
It can be prescribed as a fentanyl patch. It can be a lollipop. It can be used in surgery. So there's different forms
Right.
lawfully prescribed.
And the fentanyl that is contained in a patch or a lollipop or that an anesthesiologist may administer is in a very controlled and known manner, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about the illicit street drugs that
And its concentration is constant and tested, and we know what the concentration value is.
involve or include fentanyl, you have really no way of knowing what the particular fentanyl concentration is literally from pill to pill. Agreed?
Correct.
And so every single pill you take, it becomes a unique experience for the person, right?
That's true.
And so regardless of whether you have a tolerance or a non-tolerance, any single incident could cause an adverse reaction.
Well, sure. If you suddenly had a pill that was 10 times the amount of fentanyl than another one, then yes.
And you have no idea, right?
You don't know from pill to pill, true.
Right, because they're not manufactured in a controlled environment.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, you understand that there were some pills found on a floor of the squad car,
That's my understanding, yes.
and those pills were tested and contained the DNA of George Floyd, right?
I heard that, yes.
And presumably those pills were not in there prior to Mr. Floyd being in the squad car, right?
He doesn't know that. Objection.
I assume not, yes.
And so you understand that as those pills were tested, those pills were at least appeared to be partially ingested or partially dissolved.
Okay.
And so there would be evidence of an acute ingestion of fentanyl and or methamphetamine at the time Mr. Floyd was in the backseat of the squad car.
Objection, Your Honor. Object still calls for speculation.
Let's do one objection. Which one would you like?
I think he's going to sustain that.
It's the same.
Calls for conclusion.
Are you familiar with the term hooping?
Objection, outside scope.
You can answer it if you know.
I don't.
Now, in terms of your slideshow, and I don't have an electronic copy of it. Some follow-up questions on some of your slides. You reviewed in 2020 a total of 19,185 fatal overdose cases, right?
No, not necessarily fatal overdoses. They were cases that were from medical examiners where we found fentanyl in a peripheral blood sample. But they could have been homicides, they could have been other drugs involved, so they were just basically random fentanyl concentration.
Gotcha. So someone may have been shot as a part of and killed as a result of a gunshot, but as a result of the autopsy process, they collected the blood and analyzed the blood as a part of the normal autopsy process, right?
Correct.
So the cause or manner of death being, gunshot wound, homicide, but we still look at the blood,
Yes.
right? Okay. And it was a total of 19,185, right?
Correct. Peripheral blood samples.
So when the slide says 19,185 fatal overdose cases, you're not suggesting, it's somewhat misleading, I think, to me, because you're suggesting it's a fatal overdose case.
I didn't think it said that.
Well, we can,
If it did, I mean, that was something I corrected on the other day, and I said that's not correct.
okay. So just, this is, and I apologize for the writing, where it says fatal overdose cases, that's not correct.
Well, the sidebar. So hooping is placing a foreign item in your rectum to attempt to smuggle it into a location. For some reason, that's the second time this has came up. Somebody knows that he had drugs up his butt, or he wouldn't keep bringing it up. Now, I don't know how he's going to get it in or why he hadn't been more specific about it. I would have asked that question in order to get hooping in what are some ways of inducing drugs into the body? And he would say smoking, injecting, orally, and through the rectum.
Here's the jury. We're going to take our 20-minute recess. We're going to do a little work in the break, but we'll give you 20 minutes. Thanks.
All right, so they're taking a break. Oh, I guess we're going to get to hear after they kick the jury out. So let's see what's going on.
Yes, sir. I received a Bates stamp 49606, and apparently, and I printed it, and I started working on my preparation. Apparently, at some point, I received an updated copy of this same presentation, and it's 49623. So it's like 17 pages later, and I'm just trying to verify when I received that, because I was using this as preparation. This was all last night.
Fair enough.
Your Honor, this would have all been provided in the same course of discovery. I'm not sure if it was the same batch that went out, but obviously the witness, during our witness prep, the witness that were made updates, the slides were updated, the updated slides were shown to the jury,
A little time.
and then he tried to.
So I understand what Mr. Nelson has was an earlier version. Witness has since updated them. You showed the jury during direct with the updated version.
He has both, Your Honor.
Who has both?
Mr. Nelson.
No, I'm asking you. You showed the updated version to the jury.
That's correct.
All right. When was the updated version sent to Mr. Nelson?
I would expect the same day that the original version was, or my best guess was to April
She just, I can't hear her, but she's whining and crying and excuses. Oh, this woman drives me nuts.
6th. I would have to confirm.
April 6th? So this Tuesday?
Correct, Your Honor, it was within the same day that the other slides were sent. They just needed updates.
Well, very well. Let's take our break and let's nail it down specifically, but I think we can hardly, there's a lot of moving parts. I don't think anybody's it. I think you can just acknowledge that this is what you received, without showing it again, that you received an earlier version that's been updated.
And that's fine, Your Honor. I mean, part of the problem that we're experiencing here is I'm getting these things in many of these items in PDF format, right? Some of them I'm getting electronically from, there's so many people involved here that I'm getting things in different formats. So if I can have a second to speak with Ms. Voss.
Yeah, I guess it just seems like there's a good faith passing in the night of different versions, and nobody should be criticized. Or again, let's just tell the jury this is the latest one, and this is.
Nobody should be criticized. Bullshit. The government had this all this time. The government provided him something that they were going to use, and now they change it because they know he's a 1-man or 2-man show, and they're a 4, 6, or 20-man show, and they get to screw with the defense in other ways in order to affect him. To me, this is tampering with the defense. I think this is bullshit, but this always happens. Government, that's why I say government is always stacked in their favor. They get all the rules. They get to ignore the rules. They get to give immunity. Defense can't give immunity. They get to call who they want. They get to put on their state first. You notice the defense is farther away from the jury. Prosecution always gets to sit next to the jury because that proximity has been learned over time that they connect more because who's ever closer. So you'll never see the defense sitting next to the jury because the government takes every advantage it can to beat down the pesky citizen to get what they want.
This is what it is.
And that's perfectly fine, Your Honor, and I am happy to provide an extra copy. We are happy to provide and republish the slides that were presented.
Oh, now you're all ready. On the day of trial, when he's got a question that he can't change his defense, you're all willing to be helpful. Isn't that nice of you?
But I do want to make sure that we're not showing the jury inaccurate information. That's all.
So it's my fault, Your Honor, because we received apparently the second version on April 6th, and I must have looked and just assumed it was the second copy of the same thing.
Let's just clean it up when the jury comes back. Tell them that you were relying on an earlier version. The amended version is the one that the witness showed during direct examination, and leave it at that.
Yeah, and perhaps it would help if I could get a copy of that.
Okay, work on it until we're done with the break. Let's reconvene at, where are we at now? About 2:40 or 3:40? 3:40. Thank you.
I got 3:54. What time is he on? I like the way the judge handled it. Look, let's not get excited. Let's not accuse anybody of misconduct, blah, blah. But this is a common practice and procedure for the prosecution to screw with the defense in any way we can. Discover late, discover lots, change what you discover so you can rediscover it Say you discover a lot and maybe forget one page by accident, and unless he catches it, they'll never know you forgot it. Those are all prosecution tricks. All right, we'll end that there. I'll start another one.